This is Antic, the Atari 8-Bit podcast. I'm Kay Savitz. If you were into computers and you lived in California in the 1980s and 1990s, you might have read MicroTimes magazine. Mary Eisenhart was editor of MicroTimes magazine, a free advertising-supported magazine that was distributed in California. Mary started as a writer for the magazine for the first issue, May 1984, and quickly ascended to the helm, and she remained at the magazine until 1998, producing more than 180 issues. MicroTimes provided interviews, computer industry news, rumors and columns, and of course, advertising. For most of its run, there were two editions of each issue, Northern California and Southern California. When she left MicroTimes, Mary took with her a copy or two of every issue, which years later were scanned by Internet Archive. This almost complete collection is now online, full-text searchable, where they can be read online or downloaded. As a young teenager growing up in Southern California, I read MicroTimes whenever I could find it, which was usually in record stores. It was a great computer magazine with the huge bonus that it was free. When I graduated college in Northern California, I wrote for MicroTimes as often as possible. Mary was my editor. The $200 per article paychecks were the start of my freelance writing career. Mary and I don't talk too much about Atari in this interview, but rest assured there was plenty of material of interest to Atari lovers in MicroTimes. For instance, issue 1 has an interview with John Freeman and Ann Westphal, creators of Archon. A 1985 cover article features the people behind the print shop, and there was a long-running Atari ST column written by Helmi Kobler. This interview took place on November 25th, 2024.
I got into writing partly because I am a recovering comp lit major, and writing is something that I have always been decent at and hated, because you're just getting so I'd much rather clean up other people's writing than have to generate large amounts of it on my own. So people are always, "Oh, Mary, you should write. Mary, you should write." And I'm going, "No, thank you very much." But then I got into the Grateful Dead, and shortly after that, I went to a Jerry Garcia show, which was so great. It just kept me awake all night. And I have to write a review of this, and then I have to send it to BAM, neither of which I had ever done. But BAM was the music magazine at the time.
Bay Area music, right?
Bay Area music, yeah. It was one of those free newsprint things that they passed out in record stores, which at the time was a revolutionary concept, because my boss, Dennis Erickson, had more or less figured out that where magazines actually made their money was on the ad sales, and there was no point going to all this pain and suffering over charging money for the magazine when you were actually making all your money selling the ads anyway. And so he came up with BAM being a free music magazine, and it was pretty successful and pretty influential. And so I was a fan, and so I sent off just completely over the transom, stayed up pulled whatever it was to write this review, which was, looking back on it now, is seriously cringeworthy, and sent it to BAM and went about my business, which at that time was working in retail still, I think, yeah. And weeks passed, and I got a letter in the U.S. mail, because that's where we were at that point in time, from Blair Jackson, who was the editor of BAM. And he says, who kind of unbeknownst to me, was a big heavy-duty Deadhead already, and was engaged in constant trying to get Grateful Dead stuff into the magazine, and being told, "No, you can't," because it wasn't like today. Grateful Dead was not mainstream. Grateful Dead was viewed with suspicion and side eye, and so it was an ongoing thing. So he writes me back, and he says, "We've got about as much Grateful Dead related stuff as we can take right now, but hey, you can write. What else do you want to do?" And so, I sort of sat there in shock for a while, and then I said, "How about?" So I called her. I said, "Well, how about David Lindley?" Because David Lindley was just about to release his first solo album after being a backup person for Jackson Browne and being a fabulous studio musician and whatnot. And so I had been a fan of his for a while. And so I said, okay, fine, you go down to the Keystone Palo Alto and review that show. So in due course I did that, and that's how I got started writing. Dennis, my boss, the founder, at some point, some years later, a few years later, connected with a guy in Southern California by the name of Don Hamilton, and in a night of brainstorming and celebration, decided they should spin off a computer magazine based on the same principles, being free, supported by ad sales, and so on. And and so they did. And at the time, I was the junior most person on the BAM editorial staff, having just been hired as a part-time proofreader as well as my writing. Um, and the guys senior to me wanted nothing to do with a computer magazine, and I kind of was okay. I kind of like this job. I want to keep it, and so I said, okay, fine. And so, sometime later, I was assigned to do the first cover story of MicroTimes, which you will see here in very dog-eared, torn up form. You have a cleaner copy, I think, in the archive, but this is the
Nice.
original. And fortunately for this is uh May 1984. And at that time, I knew extreme nothing about computers. Nothing. But fortunately for me, my friend Bennett Falk had acquired an Osborne and gone to work for doing tech support for a time sharing service, because that's also where we were in the world at that time. And so he knew about computers. So I said, okay, Bennett, come along. We're going to go do a cover story now. And so we're driving all the way down to Mountain View to interview these game developers, about which I also know nothing, except that I was working at Payless and we were kind of selling the Atari, the the early Ataris with the plugged into your TV and did all those things. So we sold a lot of those at Christmas at Payless, and that's basic, and Commodores also. And that's what I knew about computers. So all the way down to Mountain View, I'm going, Bennett, what's RAM? Bennett, what's K? Bennett, what? And Bennett is cheerful. Bennett, who went on to write our Unix column, is cheerfully explaining all this to me, and we blundered through it, and so we did our covers, and things took off from there. And fortunately for us, things got, I knew, I managed to meet and connect with a lot of interesting people at that time. And also the Mac was just coming out, which put a whole new spin on a lot of things. So, we sort of chugged along in, I don't know if we were even monthly in the first year. We were kind of, we did a few issues in 1984, and then in 1985 something happened. I think we had, early in the winter of 84, 85, Whole Earth was, I think they were launching the well, and their Whole Earth catalog was doing a whole lot of computer related stuff, and so I was following all that. And so we called up Stuart Brown and said, hey, let's do an interview. And Stuart Brown says, no, no, I don't want to do any interviews. Go away. He says, but you know who you should talk to is Andrew Flugelman, who wrote this application called PC Talk, which was I maybe the original telecom program for PC clones. Anyway, really early, and it was a pioneer in a number of ways, including the shareware concept, that you could use it, and if you wanted to support it, you could pay for it.
Sure.
So I said, okay, fine, and we went and talked to him, and he was a really, really interesting guy, and had lots of interesting things to say, and basically put us on a track of interesting stuff that went on forever. And then between the time we did the interview and the time that it came out, he jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge.
Yikes.
And
Well,
consequently, this fish wrap from Oakland had the last interview with him.
Wow.
And that rather than any excellence on our part was probably the first thing that put us on the map.
Huh.
Because suddenly real computer magazines were calling us up and saying, what about this? And that was that was the beginning of a lot of interesting connections, like with the Hackers Conference and just meeting people who were doing interesting things and on and off the beaten track. That's a good stopping place. I could go on. I have quite a stack of back issues pulled out, mostly from the late 80s, early 90s, because we by about 1987 we were on a roll, and the roll went on into the early 90s, and and we had a lot of fun. So, but you should get a word in edgewise
Yeah, let
here.
me ask a couple questions. So I'm curious, was Dennis interested in computers, or was like strictly a new business market that he saw as a publisher?
Oh, he's definitely interested in computers to this day. But Dennis is a very bright guy and an interesting guy in his own right, but in many ways. But no, he's very good at seeing when something interesting is going on and zeroing in on it. And it was definitely it was definitely an emerging market, but it was also an interesting emerging market. And he actually um he said he had something that he said back in those days about new interesting things like personal computers were in those days, that they're really great and they're really interesting and they're really alive, and then they turn into the insurance business. And so we were there before it turned into the insurance business, and I think it was a really great time to be there, because a lot of things we did a lot of things that were kind of unimaginable by today's standards.
We'll get to that in a minute. But I want to ask the same question about you. You said you didn't know anything about computers. Was this strictly a way to keep your job, or were you interested in computers? Did you have any
Uh,
experience?
a little of both. Fairly early on, especially, I, I would say initially it was almost entirely okay, fine, we'll keep the gig and see where it goes. But it almost immediately got really interesting. Um, like fairly as part of the Whole Earth thing, they did the first Hackers Conference, and Fabrice Florin did a documentary about it. And I saw that fairly early on, and that was just revelatory on a lot of ways and life-changing. And undoubtedly you have seen it. It's pretty well seen. It's on YouTube and so on. But one of the things that I was particularly drawn to, who was this guy by the name of Dave Hughes from Colorado Springs. Dave Hughes was a retired Army colonel who went to West Point and got medals in the Korean War and stuff like that, and uh, discovered the BBS scene in Col and was basically a huge pioneer of the BBS scene in Colorado Springs, and was basically my first introduction to the concept of you could find people with that you had common interests with and talk to them without the restrictions of time and space and social conventions and all that crapola. And he talked, I don't think it's in the documentary, but it's somewhere else in some clip somewhere. He talks about how they had some civic issue going on in Colorado Springs, and there was a hotly contested election going on, and basically there were two factions on the BBS that argued each other to a standstill, with two people left standing, um, who basically agreed to disagree because they couldn't take it any further. And then some weeks later, they had a party for a real-time gathering of these people so that they could meet face to face. And those combatants were a retired Air Force colonel and a 12-year-old girl. And that to me was just it. Um, that was somewhat different from the computer business as a whole, but to me that, oh yes. And so things got interesting down that whole path really fast. I was lucky to interview Dave a few times um and thanks to him connect with other people in that scene, especially Dwayne Hendricks, who recently passed away and was just an incredible guy. And so, when I first got into it, it was like, okay, but it met all kinds of interesting people, and just following the interesting people, there was always something interesting to write about. So,
So you said you did things that were unimaginable by today's standards. What, for instance?
uh, just that it was so wide open. You in a lot of cases, um, everything is how to put it. It wasn't doors opened up that had not been opened before, and as things got more mature and ossified in the industry, those doors closed again. And so things were just it was a freewheeling moment where you could it was also a time where it was small enough that everybody kind of still knew each other. So people who were chairman of the board and stuff would also take your phone calls.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think Philippe Kahn was on our cover 3 or 4 times. And he's always had something interesting to talk about. And we're still friends on Facebook. And um, but what Dennis's thing was that it's more in people are probably going to be more interested in picking up the magazine if it's about the people rather than the stuff, because anybody can review products. And in some senses that was true, and in some case, and we definitely went with it, and we developed a pretty strong ethos of no, we are not going to burn you if you talk to us. We did not. I mean, a lot of journalism is expected to be adversarial, and we were a lot more collegial than that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Not necessarily because we were ad supported, because we were very rarely talking to people that bought ads from us. Um, but it's not. I remember one time when Bill Campbell, who was a great guy, was at Claris. Um, and Claris was doing something noteworthy that we really wanted to put the FileMaker. I think they had just done something spectacular with FileMaker or something. And we really want to come down and do a card. No, no, no. Bill is not talking. That somebody just whoever it was just came down and did a horrible hit piece on it. No, no, no. And I said, we're not like that. Ask anybody. And so we went down there. And we'll go down there and say, okay, Bill, these are your quotes. This is what we think you said. Did you say this? And because we were not out there to make them look bad. We also weren't there to make money off of them, but we were kind of not there to be their adversary. It wasn't a courtroom. It wasn't Geraldo. We were not going to go all Geraldo. Going all Geraldo was sort of in fashion then.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we were not those people. I mean, we came up from rock and roll where we were we're hanging out with the famous rock stars. And so we were bringing a little of the hanging out with the famous rock stars attitude toward that. And it worked in funny ways too, because Jim Marshall, the famous photographer, Dennis did a bunch of ad trade with him. So we ran a lot of ads for Jim Marshall's photos, and Jim Marshall did a lot of MicroTimes covers. And I was like, No, Dennis, don't make me work with Jim Marshall because Jim Marshall was ornery. I mean, this was after the years when Jim Marshall was famous for hanging out his window all coked up and shooting people with his shotgun, but still Jim Marshall was no day at the beach on the best day of his life. And once you knew him, this was part of his charm, but um many was the photo shoot where all the way down we would drive down and he would tell me all the terrible things that he was going to do. And I go, you do, and I pull the plug on the chute so fast your little head will spin. And uh and then he would get there and the people that he would take pictures, oh my God, Jim Marshall. And of course he would just be sweet as pie and the pictures would be great and everybody would be happy. But we were nobody else had Jim Marshall doing their covers. And we just had odd little things like that that we could bring to bear.
That's amazing. Did you have a firewall between advertising and editorial? Was there?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, they could say we talked about well, being a local fish wrap, the advertising was coming from they were almost all retailers because they were all mostly clone retailers, pretty much. And then there was Fry's, which had you know, if the issue was 350 pages, at least 75 of it was the Fry's ad. And make no mistake, people picked up that magazine for the Fry's ad. And then they read Jim Warren, and then they read John Dvorak, and then they read all those things, and all those things were, and they read the Atari people picked up for the Atari column, and the Amiga picked up for the Amiga column, and everybody had something that they could pick it up for. But let's not kid ourselves about the Fry's ad. The Fry's ad mattered a lot. But
May they rest in peace.
may they rest in peace, and there are remarkable stores with them.
Hmm. Um, was there ever, back to the firewall question, was there ever anything where an advertiser was upset about something that was written or that you recall?
Uh, not not that I can think of because we also we had an editorial calendar, so it was like, okay, this is going to be our networks issue, and so this is what we're going to have in the networks issue, and so you can kind of sell around that. And um and this is going to be our games issue, and this is going to be our holiday issue. So we talk to each other, and they were definitely um we tried to be synergistic, I think, but it was not the kind of thing. But basically, they believed me when I said editorial integrity mattered, you know,
Yeah.
because credibility is hard to win, and once you lose it, it's hard to get it back. So and especially for what we had pretty good credibility, and we also just had weird stuff you weren't going to get anywhere. Well, things that you would not ever see today. Dvorak's column in which Beelzebub interviews Bill Gates. We repeated that a couple times. It was sort of so. I mean, people were just having. There was a lot more having fun with it, and a lot less beating people over the head.
Yeah. Nice. Okay, and after not too long, there were two editions of the magazine, then the Northern California edition and the Southern California edition.
Right.
My assumption has always been that was just because of advertising. You could have SoCal and
Mostly because of advertising. And especially since Fry's was not in Southern California for a long time, and so the southern issues were skinnier for a long time because Fry's wasn't there, but eventually that caught up also. But some of our writers were based in Southern California, some of them were based in Northern California. Generally, they had subjects rather than local focuses. But we'd go down there for trade shows and they'd come up here for trade shows, and so we'd all get to know each other that way. But yeah, we would, since the issues were fairly significant print jobs. They were printed 2 weeks apart. And this led to one of my most embarrassing moments, which, hold on just a second. This here is the Northern California edition
Okay. We've got Live from Chaos Manor at home
with
with Jerry.
Jerry Pournelle on the cover, science
Mhm.
fiction writer. Um, this I don't know if you know Jerry Pournelle, who is now also passed, but he was a science fiction writer of some repute. He was also a pretty curmudgeonly kind of guy, but it was an art form with him. And a renowned curmudgeon in conservative circles and whatnot. But I knew him from Hackers Conference, and I knew him from this, that, and the other. And it came to pass in whatever year that was, that Worldcon was going to be in San Francisco. And I'm not that hardcore on science fiction, but I knew darn well that we should seize the moment of Worldcon being at Moscone. And so I said, Dennis actually is a hardcore science fiction guy. Dennis, we need a booth at Worldcon. And he goes, ooh, yeah, we do. And so we got a booth at Worldcon, and we thought it would just be perfect to have Jerry Pournelle on the cover, and life would be totally swell. And so we did that. We had a Southern California writer, Wayne Yako, who wrote a Networks column for us most of the time. We went and interviewed him because he knew him fairly well from those circles. And the Southern California edition came out first, naturally. And his name was misspelled on the cover
Mm. Mm. Mm.
in his hometown.
Yeah.
And I'm dying of more. But by the time we got to Worldcon, this one was his name spelled correctly. Everything is cool. And so what we're passing out the northern edition, and everybody's getting the correct thing. But I decided that I had probably better slink over to Jerry's booth at Worldcon and where he was signing his new book, and just go get over there and grovel because there was nothing else to be done. So I went over there, got in the book signing line, groveled, and he signs the book, hands it to me pretty much without a word. Off I go. When I get to look at that book, he has misspelled every word in the inscription. I cherish that book to this day.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's great.
So it was crazy stuff like that we could get away with at the time.
It's funny. I actually just quoted Jerry Purnell in I think the last interview that I published. He had reviewed some CPM product, and his review was the one that I liked the best, and I quoted it in my introduction. Um, and something about that product that you made me think of earlier is this was some cable for connecting your Atari computer to a CPM machine, and it was created by um, this kid who was 16 years old when he created this product, and it was
Mhm.
written up in uh, InfoWorld and Dr. Dobbs and Byte.
Mhm.
All the publications covered this product, and I don't know if they didn't know or they didn't care that it was created by a 16-year-old.
Mhm.
But to me, that's the interesting thing, and that's like if they were covering the people and not the products, like you
Right,
said.
right. Like our second issue, which I don't think I have here anymore, had Will Harvey, who is now I think he has gone on to great things in the games world, but I haven't really followed his career. But he was a 16-year-old and he had just done this hotshot game for Electronic Arts, and so he was our second cover. So yeah, it was like it didn't matter how old you were, and it didn't matter if you were rich, and it didn't matter if you'd been to that was something that I was seeing a lot of. I was seeing a lot of brilliant high school dropouts, um, who just, could not deal with. It earlier, slightly before this era, I had been I had been teaching ROP up at Richmond High School, where they had a good computer science class, but also in ROP, but
I'm sorry, I don't know what ROP is.
regional occupational
Oh,
program.
okay.
I don't know what it goes by these days, but it was basically job training in high school. We would get high school and adults in there and do job training. And I was teaching retail because Lord knows I had spent enough time working in retail. Um, but there was this one kid by the name of Owen, whose last name will come to me eventually, but he was then a senior who was who basically his whole schedule was in the computer science program, I think. But his thing was getting into the PDP, whatever it was, in every morning and marking himself present in all his classes, and so that he could just hack in peace all day long. Um, and I don't know whether he eventually graduated or some startup snatched him away, but it was that kind of period where startups were snatching away brilliant kids out of high school too. And a lot of them were going to Apple. And I mean, a lot of people that I knew at Apple in those days were still teenagers.
Yeah.
So it was just more wide open.
Um, so I'd like to hear about any particularly memorable stories or interviews that you did. Um, what springs to mind when you think about your people you talked to at MicroTimes?
Oh, just so many of them were so interesting, but and they all have and they all have backstories. But let me. Here is the Bill Gates cover.
All right, another side of Bill Gates. What's the date on that one?
The date of this is November 12th, 1990. And the interview is by John Perry Barlow, co-founder of the Electronic Frontier Foundation and lyricist for the Grateful Dead, and sadly also now deceased. But that was one of the synergies that came in from the Grateful Dead side, and also the Well, is that Barlow was really active on the Well. Barlow immediately also saw the potential of online communications and connecting with people from remote distances and stuff like that. And so, due to the Grateful Dead conference on the Well, which I was one of the founders of, um, I knew him, and it turned out to be very mutually useful to send him off to interview people and grab the interview and transcribe it and put it up immediately, because he had marquee value. He was always asked interesting stuff, and people would talk to him. They didn't and so um I would, for several of these interviews, notably the Gates and the Steve Jobs, I would go along just to keep an eye on things. There's the photo shoot happening at the same time, just to keep an eye on things. But he was doing the interview, and I was not going to horn in. Except, again, we would drive down to San Jose, and he would be going, "Oh, I'm going to do this terrible thing because Gates did this terrible thing to my pal Mitch." And no. Going, "Oh no, you're not." But then, Barlow is a very interestingly connected, smart guy, and so he said, well, he wanted to ask Bill Gates about philanthropy because at this stage in the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was not even a gleam in the eye at this point. So philanthropy was not really particularly on the radar. And I agreed with him that this would be an interesting thing to talk about. And so comes the interview, and I'm sitting there basically watching everything and waving at the photographer and flipping the tapes as needed and whatnot. And so Barlow says, so back in the day, John D. Rockefeller and Bill Gates leaps from his chair and says, Microsoft is not a monopoly like Standard Oil. And we're like, and basically no, and so basically his handlers calmed him down, and we went on to talk about philanthropy, and it went on. It's a really interesting interview, but I mean he was really like Standard Oil, no, and I mean it was just a surreal moment. I mean there we were in the lobby of the Fairmount.
Little defensive there, Bill.
You're like what? But he had several handlers, and it was like, no, maybe it's okay. Maybe these people aren't out to get you. But so and so it was a great interview, and but what Barlow really had the hots to do was interview Steve Jobs, and I'm going, no, Barlow. Steve Jobs is an annoying person and he's very full of himself and who needs the aggravation? And oh no, I really want to. And so by this time, Barlow was jetting around the world in Mitch Kapor's private jet to conferences all over the world and having a fine old time. So he basically knew all these big shot guys to say hi to at least. And so he got into this MCI mail correspondence with Steve Jobs about how he really wanted to interview Steve from MicroTimes. And Steve is like, I don't have time to talk to you for this stupid local paper. Cool your jets. And Barlow says, okay, but my interview with Bill Gates for that stupid local paper has been getting feedback from Moscow. And Steve says, oh, okay, fine. And that, which that was something
There he
because
is, next in the real world. Mm-hmm.
this is February 17th, 1992.
Mm-hmm.
Steve Jobs, he was at Next at the time, and Barlow was very enamored with Next. And he had one, and he basically thought it was the best things in the world. And so Steve is down there lording it at Next, and Steve has, I mean, we know going in that he has all these sleazy tricks, but like about 5 minutes into the interview, he has this underling bustle into the room and show him this urgent memo. And he shakes his head and says, no. But this is a ploy because it's to extract him from interviews if he doesn't feel like doing it. But in the end, for all the trips and craziness and all that, and I'm sitting there flipping the tapes and going, why are we dealing with this brat? It was great. And we got another great interview. I think it wound up being so long that it ran in two parts. But so that was kind of a coup also. But we just went around pursuing cool stuff. Apropos of which, let's see. Surely I have it over here. Okay, one of the things that Jim Warren, who was the founder of the Computer Fair and the PC Fair, and came to write a column for us called Realizable Fantasies about basically whatever he wanted to write about that month. And he was a huge draw, and we became pretty good friends. And he invited me to be part of the Asilomar microcomputer workshop, which is still going on to this day, and I'm still on their board. But at the time, it was a relatively it was only about 15 years old at the time, but I have been involved with it ever since. And it is basically this off the record information sharing, interesting stuff, cutting edge things. So we would get the the first year I was there, it was the year of the the 386, it was the year of the 486
Mhm.
and Intel 46 and whatever the Motorola counterpart was, whose name I'm blanking on.
Okay.
And we had both development teams there, schmoozing and getting drunk in the post parties. And they had each done sessions on what they had done and why they had done it and stuff like this. And as the liquor flowed more freely in the evening, they would sit there talking to each other and go, we had that problem. And if you do this, the problem goes away. And it's kind of that kind of thing where there is a strong sense of ethics. There is a strong sense of we are not going to share what goes on here with our bosses, but we are also not going to abuse the privilege of what we're hearing. And one of the guys who was part of that was a guy by the name of Bruce Cobol, who does a lot of sound engineering stuff. And Bruce had somehow connected with Neil Young, not through the rock and roll side, but through the Lionel Trains side, because Neil was a bit, I think he had actually acquired controlling interest in Lionel Trains at that point and was really big on getting the tech into the electric trains. And he had come to Asilomar and done a presentation, and it was kind of it was kind of my proudest moment is that here are all these hardcore nerd boys who are also hardcore Neil fans who would rather die than be fanboys and embarrass Neil. So they were just treating him like another nerd boy. And it was great. And since I have seen Neil in many situations where everyone's pouncing on him, um, I mean, it was just that kind of vibe was so much better. And so in the course of all this good feeling, I said, "So Neil, let's do a cover." And Neil said, "Oh, sure, fine, but here's Elliot Roberts's phone number." And so I call Elliot Roberts, who's the famous Neil's PR guy. And Elliot Roberts is, and I'm like, you know, Forrest Gump here. Oh, Neil said he'd talk to me. Can we get it set up? Elliot Roberts says, "Who the hell are you? Go away, drop." But Neil said, So eventually, I broke down. We got through the Elliot Roberts resistance, and we got up at some place up in Woodside or up thereabouts. We did an interview in with Neil about the electric trains. And Elliot Roberts says, "You can't talk about music," because Elliot Roberts was afraid the interview would creep into BAM, which he had been steadfastly refusing interviews for these many years. And no, 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 we're talking about the Lionel train. Fine, so fine, we're going to talk about the Lionel trains, Elliot. So I'm talking to Neil in this coffee shop in Woodside, and eventually he veers into something. I think he's always been fanatical about the quality of digital recording, and this is at a fairly early stage and all that. So he got to talking about this, and I said, "Neil, Elliot says we can't talk about music." And he looks at me and says, "We're talking about sound." And so it was a lot of fun.
Nice.
And this was our cover.
There's the cover. Nice.
Um, and
Neil
uh,
Young and Lion Tech.
yeah,
Yeah.
and so that was a lot of fun. And that's an example of what we could do that would be unimaginable
Hmm.
today.
Nice.
So
Nice. You were talking about the boys being boys club or whatever. I have to ask, did you get any sexism, any pushback from being a woman in the computer industry?
quite the contrary. Um, I basically got treated extremely well just for being female and being there. Um, to a ridiculous extent. People were pretty much fell over themselves to be nice to me. Um, so from where I was, I always felt in fact, no, never mind. There's this tangent that went nowhere. But for me personally, no. But um, I also had a healthy respect for the fact I'm a recovering medievalist, and this is not my field. And what I could see about, but actually, the part of the medieval period that I specialized in grad school and never went back to was called the 12th century Renaissance, which was one of those really interesting periods where suddenly, again, everything just opened up and things became possible that never were. Not always for the best of reasons. It's like these guys went off, decided that they would go off to on the Crusades and save the Holy Land, which by anybody's reasonable standard was a bad idea. But they came back with their eyes completely opened up to all kinds of stuff that they had no idea about. And they, scholarly stuff and artistic stuff and all kinds of things. And there would be this great flowering, and then it would kind of just all go to crap in about 15 years. And this is kind of, and then the 60s kind of did kind of the same thing. And I'm going, hey, there's a pattern here. And here's the computer thing coming along. And I think I'm kind of seeing this movie here, and let's see where it goes. And so I don't think my interest was necessarily typical at any point.
Okay, great.
Weird,
Um,
yes, but
I'm sorry.
weird perhaps, but
All right, so this is an Atari podcast, so I need to ask if you have any stories or memories about Atari things or people.
this I do not have the issue. So it may be in the missing box that is still floating around someplace. But at a certain point in when the Atari and the Amiga, and there were other platforms besides Mac and PC, and it seemed like they were going to go interesting places. Um, we went down and did a cover story at Atari, um, and put Sam and Leonard, Jack being out of the picture by then, Sam and Leonard Tramiel were on the cover, and I remember very little about the interview except that their office windows faced Moffett Field, and Leonard would stopped the whole interview because the U2 was taking off and they wanted to watch it. And this was sort of an annual ritual at Atari was watching the U2 take off from Moffett Field. But
Nice.
they were very interesting guys. And you know, innovative and hard-headed at the same time. And I think the PC clones definitely won the day, but there was a lot of interesting stuff going on in that world for a long time.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that. I mean, when you started with MicroTimes, there were 50 different computing platforms, the Atari and the Commodore and whatever, Macintosh. And then it became more homogenous over
Mhm.
time, and became a world of mostly PCs with a little bit Macintosh. So, did the magazine have to change as the computer industry changed?
I think, well, yeah, well, definitely things that things that didn't exist in 1984 became an important thing to talk about. I mean, in 1984, networks were probably not uppermost on anybody's mind, but they became important pretty fast. Um, HyperCard, Burl Walsh for years wrote a HyperCard column as soon as it came along, which again, who knew at the beginning, but it was an interesting thing, and there was always cool stuff to be done with it. Unix, we were unusual in that we wrote about Unix, and we would do things like put Silicon Graphics and Sun Microsystems on the cover. This improved our nerd cred a good deal, just because we acknowledged that that stuff existed, and we weren't in our little PC silo or our little Mac silo or whatever. Things are quite siloed now. I mean, people are in multiple silos, but it's very easy to kind of just hear echoes of what you have heard before and build on that and never get any outside inputs at all. And this is a blessing and a curse. But there was this more varied stuff going on in that time, and more people were talking to each other, and it was more about there were definitely religious wars almost from the get-go, but there was also a lot of, well, here's this thing we want to get done. Is this the right tool to do it with? And uh, Atari, I mean, gaming was certainly in Atari's gene DNA in ways that I'm not an Atari person. It's been a long time. When I think of Atari, I think of Pong, because I actually know Noel and I know Al Alcorn from both from Asilomar, and so I see it as coming in a stream up from those, and it's been a bumpy ride, and I don't even know where all that technology wound up going other than into Computer History Museum at this point.
Yeah.
Uh, but at the time, it was a very dynamic scene with a lot of ferment and a lot of cross fertilization, a lot of people talking to each other in ways that they don't do now. Um, I also it was also smaller and more manageable. Uh, I mean, the internet and the way it is now is this huge, great boon, but there are a lot of things that just don't scale. And a lot of things that you could do then, because you probably knew the guy's next door neighbor or whatever, you kind of can't do that now. Um, and it's a different world to operate in, and it requires a different skill set, and it's good too, but it's not the same. And one of the things, this has absolutely nothing to do with Atari, but just all the basic personal skill set, interfacey skill sets of talking to people kind of fall by the wayside in the selling and browbeating and memeing and virtue signaling and all this, and you don't just talk to each other like human beings, and basically talking to each other like human beings is kind of how you fix things, um and it's not just hitting the check boxes on your customer service app or whatever. And I worry about where that's going, but I don't know, and that's absolutely nothing to do with Atari or anything. Um, so
Yeah. Um, Switching topics very much. I'm curious physically how the magazine got made. I imagine in the timeline you started on Paste Up and then eventually moved to desktop publishing.
correct. And then And during the pay stub era, when I was also the proofreader, I made myself very unpopular by being able to stand across a room, look at a flat across the room that I had proofed 3 times already, and go, nope, and zero in on the typo of the flat across the room, get the X-Acto knife and cut it out. They hated me. They hated me. So it was a big improvement when instead of physically shipping all those flats to Reno, they could just send PDFs. Or I don't think there were PDF. I don't think initially there were PDFs. I think it was briefly PageMaker and then almost immediately Quark Express. And I think it was in Quark Express for the duration. But I was not the person who did that. The art department did that.
So
And then
I'm sorry, go ahead.
the printers were in Reno, and one time we did a tour of the printing press. I said, oh, a huge colossal thing, yeah. Man. So it was a massive undertaking, and we had platoons of drivers and vans going and delivering the magazines all over the place. And then they'd be passed out at trade shows and
Mhm.
things like that.
Do you remember what the circulation was at its peak?
The circulation should be on the mastheads at all times.
Okay.
So it was in the hundreds of thousands. But uh, it had very good circulation. It was. In its heydays, I think it was in the multiple hundreds of thousands. But I'd have to go look. But I think I think it's in the masthead of each issue what the circulation is at that point.
Now, earlier, you were calling the magazine Fish Wrap, and you said you were like a little local publication. But as a reader and later writer of MicroTimes, I felt like it was, even though it was just California, it was absolutely on par in the editorial quality and in the importance of whatever Byte and InfoWorld and all the big guys. How do you feel about that?
We tried, because the thing is that we were coming up against low expectations, and I was kind of fine with that, because after all, it's not like I was God's gift to MIT, you know? What did I know? We were flying by the seat of our pants and putting it together to be interesting, but that turned out to be the right thing to do. So no, I had a ton of respect for it and held it to high standards and had people who held it to high standards, and each in their own way did their thing with passion and integrity, and it came across. Now, if what magazines were supposed to do is focus on a niche and bombard the hell out of that niche with related product propaganda. And we didn't do that, and that's not who we were, and that's not what people picked us up for. And so when we got acquired and they tried to turn us into that, it didn't work. And and when when the writing was definitely on the wall that this was happening, we all bailed, and the magazine lasted about a year after that, and they basically collapsed on itself. And I think I don't think that was inevitable, but it was what it was.
So let's talk about that. It was acquired by someone, and they wanted to change it in a way that was
There was
untenable, and so
more they wanted to, they decided that they were going to make it a niche magazine for people, for buyers of equipment for small networks. And we're like, okay, that's not what we've done for 14 years, but see ya.
Yeah.
But fortunately, in the course of going see you, I threw all those back issues into my car, and now you have.
No, I haven't. So yeah, we should tell the story about that. You threw the back issues in your car, and then eventually they found their way to Jason Scott at Internet Archive, who then they sat in the archive warehouse for many, many years. And I beat the drum just forever. I was just like, we need to get these scanned. We need to get them scanned. And eventually they were right now. I mean, today, Internet Archive has an amazing tracking system for their material. You give them an object, they can tell you, what box it is, in what storage container, in what city, and whatever. They can
Mhm.
do that. At the time when you donated these items,
Not
it
so
was
much.
it was not so much. It was just like, yep, it's in a cardboard box labeled MicroTimes. It's somewhere in Richmond, and so by the time, I mean, these magazines sat in the physical storage for, I think it was 6 or 7 years, and then they found them, and I took possession of them. I'm like, these babies are mine now, and I sent them to the scanning center. But and that's how almost every MicroTimes magazine got saved and scanned. You saved them, I got them scanned, and we did it. And now almost, I mean, almost the entire run is there, except for there's like 1 year, like volume 3 is like missing.
Yeah,
Um,
and I'm pretty sure that I sent it to you, so I think it will turn up at some point. Um, and that's an interesting period, so I hope it does turn up.
Me too. Yeah,
I think it's 1986. Things started getting really interesting then.
that was a great year computer wise. Yeah, yeah. So I think it's still in a moldering box somewhere, and it will show up, and hopefully. But I mean, I'm so grateful that when you left, that you had the presence of mind to throw them into your car. Yeah.
It was like, yeah, no, I'm not gonna just let these because they didn't care. They had no respect for any of it. So they were just coming from corporate publishing, and what we did didn't exist in their world, and they didn't want to know. And we had already by this time seen that movie happen with a lot of startups that started off all happy and glowing and make it, hey, we're going to do these great things, and then they got crushed like bugs. And so, it was an old story by the time it came to us. So,
Mhm.
but it was fun while it lasted.
Did you stay in the publishing business after that, or what did you do?
A little bit. I did a little bit of writing for various publications, and I have basically just done a lot of freelance stuff ever since. And currently, I do mostly like I'm the forum moderator on dead.net, and I do social media for a lot of different people, including Bill Graham Foundation, Rex Foundation, and Hardly Strictly Bluegrass. And so I'm still doing the connecting with people regardless of physical time and space thing a lot. Um, I do a little bit of writing, reviewing kids' books for Common Sense Media, but that's more that's not like long form reviews. That's basically filling in blanks reviews. I don't do very much long form writing anymore, which is fine with me.
You never liked writing.
I've never liked writing. I mean, I'll do it when I have to, and the occasion demands it and stuff like that. But I don't like it. I'm just I back when I had to write a review for BAM and it would be like 300 words. I'd stare at the typewriter for 6 hours. Um, and eventually the review would come out pretty good. Although going back and reading it now, you go, "Oh, what an idiot I was." But that's the difference between now and the '80s, you know. But um, mm, I it's nice to be able to write, but it's not something that I'd want to be making a living doing.
So I made my living as a freelance technology writer for 13 or 14 years. And as I, as you, I don't, you probably, I don't know if you remember or know now, but MicroTimes was the first paid gig I ever did.
I think, well, how old were you when you started writing?
I mean, I wasn't even graduate college yet. So I must have been
You were pretty
nine,
young.
I was like
I don't think you
19 or
were as young. I
something.
don't think you were as young as Helmy, who was in high school.
So
But
yeah, I was like 19 or 20.
but
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. I think I had a couple 15-year-olds at some point.
nice.
But
Yeah.
but yeah, and it it's funny how it led to different places for different people, and
Hmm.
um
Yeah.
it was a very heady time, and not so long ago I was on Facebook talking back and forth to Dave Needle. Dave Needle was the editor of Computer Currents, who was our bitter crosstown arch rival.
I need to talk to him next.
I
Uh-huh.
mean, yeah, you should talk to him sometime, but he was actually lamenting the fact that nobody had saved any of those things. And I said, ha 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 ha. But and so all the stuff that he did back then, it's just gone, because a lot of it was pre-digital, pre-internet, so it was never digitized or anything. But we were talking about how it was definitely a time, and it's not like that now.
Talk to me about this bitter crosstown rivalry. How did that play out?
Uh, it was mostly between our sales guys and our publishers,
Mm.
but I was at the Computer Currents had a founder by the name of Stan Politi, and I don't know what all Stan Politi's history was, but I did not find Stan a likable guy, let's put it this way. And one time early on in our my attitude is like, hey, it's a big world, and we do our thing, you do your thing. There's plenty of room for both of us. Look at all the stuff that's happening. And then we were sitting across the table from each other at the Software Entrepreneurs Forum one, this being 84, 85 early. And Stan is just going off on us for being evil upstarts who have no right to exist and infringing. I forget what all bad stuff he was saying, but I'm just like, what? And I'm coming back. I get back to the office and say, okay, this is war. But obviously we cross paths in the course of business quite a lot, um uh, and I think I'm not sure which of us ultimately folded first, but whatever something changed about the whole business, and I don't necessarily think it needed to, but I think something didn't pivot correctly, and that's life.
Yeah.
Uh, but I think even I I think there is definitely still a place for free ad supported magazines, and I think there is still a way to do it honorably, but it's so tempting to just blast stuff up on the net instead. And who knows how it'll all evolve. But I'm glad we saved those issues.
Me too. All right, what haven't I asked you about your time at MicroTimes that I should have?
Let me tell you about two of my favorite covers. And then we can move on. This here is my John Walker cover.
Okay,
John,
Autodesk, the next generation.
this is uh this is May 11th, 1992. And this is from an interesting basically from the period where Autodesk went from the hacker empire to the corporate monolith to the grief of all. But I got in when John Walker was the founder of Autodesk, and John Walker was not one to do it to. He described himself as being as gregarious as a moray eel, and that's he wanted to hack. He didn't want to say, but he was also very intelligent, very well read, and very thoughtful on any subject. And if you go look at his website in Switzerland, he'll just hold forth on any manner of subject. And to this day, John died earlier this year and left a big hole for a lot of us. But it came to pass that John had moved to Switzerland, and then having moved to Switzerland, decided that the company was going to hell in a handbasket by being insufficiently adventuresome in its thinking. But unfortunately, they had gone public, and it was now constrained by things that it was not constrained with previously. And so he put out this thing. He basically distributed this thing called information letter number 14 that everybody read. The information letters were the way the founders communicated with people from the days that there were like the 13, I think there were 13 founders originally. And they founded the company. What got me about the company from the beginning was there was a panel at the computer fair, or maybe the PC fair, where they had all the founders of various. Adam Osborne was up there, and I think a guy from Ashton Tate was up there. Different guys, but John Walker was there, and they had gone at it from an entirely different point of view. They were systems programmers. They programmed mainframes for large corporate employers, and they were smart, and they said, oh, we should be taking advantage of this thing that's going on out there. And so all of us think of a product that we should develop, we should build a company behind, and whichever seems most promising, we'll put all the resources behind that. And so they came up with 6 potential products that they should develop, one of which was an office automation product that they called Autodesk. And they wound up naming the company after that. But one of the other guys said, no, 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 the big opportunity is in CAD, which was undreamed of it on a PC at the time. And so here's this little thing I put together. And so that was the beginning of AutoCAD, and the company the office automation thing pretty much never came to pass. They put all the resources behind AutoCAD. The rest was history for a really long time. They made tons of money, and eventually they went public. And up to that point, Autodesk was very much optimized for hacker culture. They wanted you to be, they wanted to make life as easy for brilliant programmers as possible. Bring your dog to work, stay home, live in Patagonia. I don't care, just as long as your work is up to snuff. And I loved that whole ethic appealed to me a whole lot anyway. So, I was an Autodesk fangirl from those days, and I sort of knew John a little from Hackers and the Sillamore. But it was not at all likely that we'd ever do an interview because he didn't like them and so on and so forth. But at this point in history, they had gone public. They were extremely rich, and he did not like the direction the company was going in. And they had put a lot of money into things like Xanadu and molecular modeling and things like that, some of which would turn into nothing, and some of which was completely out there, and some of which was very important. But he said, no, we have to stay keep an eye on what's going to be, instead of just getting ossified behind keep it. So there was this kind of palace coup at Autodesk, and suddenly John was in the media and all this. And suddenly, Greg Zachary, kind of unbeknownst to me at the time, Greg Zachary at the Wall Street Journal, who was very much the Geraldo model of interviewer, basically cornered the whole Autodesk board for an interview for the Wall Street Journal that turned out to be a pretty serious hatchet job. And so all this was going on in the background at a time when John was doing some minor press appearance at one of the at a PC fair or something in San Francisco, and there I was at at Brooks Hall or whatever. I say, so I come up to him after he does his little speech. I said, "So John, how about an interview?" And he looks at me funny and he says, "Sure." And so it was the most terrifying interview I've ever done. He is so smart. And so, for like 2 hours we talked to this guy. It was just exhausting. But it was also like the definitive statement of what they were trying to do, why he was trying to do it, and it basically all blew up, and Autodesk is now the corporate monolith that it is. I at a Silmar last spring, I got tapped to do the John Walker obituary, and in the course of which I delved into the Autodesk file, which is the long thing, and there was an ad that they put out right when they went public for super programmers, and it was like, "We're recruiting people like us. If this is you, come on down." And so I read that as part of the presentation. And I'm sitting in the Zoom afterwards, and this kid in Seattle says, "But Autodesk isn't like that anymore, is it?" And I'm going, "Sadly, no."
Yeah. Huh.
But I'm glad I was there when it was.
Nice.
And
Yeah, show me your other favorite cover.
the other one, which is notable, oh, in passing, related to that one, is Xanadu and Ted Nelson. Right, this is right after Autodesk had invested in Xanadu.
Sure.
And this is in 1988, April 1988. Um, the interesting thing about that interview, other than that it's Ted Nelson, is that David Gans, who is the Grateful Dead Hour person, and various other interesting Grateful Dead related things, did that interview. Because we were friends and he was looking for work, and said, "Oh, David, go interview Ted Nelson." But the other thing, that this was more or less our swan song of good covers. Hedy Lamarr.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Hedy, because in the course of knowing Dave Hughes and Dwayne Hendricks, I had gotten the whole song and dance about Hedy Lamarr and how she had invented spread spectrum. Dave Hughes was Hedy Lamarr's biggest fanboy. I mean, he would go, but as a result of this, I knew all about spread spectrum and why it was important and stuff like this. And so slightly before it was fashionable, we had Hedy Lamarr on the cover and we were talking about spread spectrum. And basically we let the magazine lasted about a year after that, but that and but I'm proud of that one.
Nice. Excellent. Yeah, that's a fun issue and a great, beautiful cover as
Yeah.
well. Yeah. I think I have what I need. Thank you.
Oh, good. I'm sorry for all the tangents, but
I no, I'm here for the tangents. That's
good.
all about it.
And thank you for salvaging these things, because I just got to the point one day where I'm saying, okay, I have a whole wall full of these back issues, and they're really taking up a lot of space in my house. And what am I really doing here?
Yeah.
So thank you for stepping up and taking them away.
You're welcome.
Yeah. And
I
and I hope people can read them for generations to come.
I believe that they will be able to. They're all, and now, being an Internet Archive, they're full text searchable. So I mean, if something was mentioned in passing, whatever, you can find it. It's amazing.
Go read Beelzebub interviews Bill Gates. It's a classic.
Great. Thank you, Mary. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. Take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute something, please consider supporting my Patreon at patreon.com/Savitz. I've been publishing interviews like these since 2013 and would like to continue doing so for a long time, and your financial support will help. Thanks.